On the afternoon of December the 10th, 1936, in a ground floor room at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, a man sat at a desk and signed away the British throne. Edward VIII wrote his name 7 times, once for each parliament of the dominions. 3 men stood behind him. They were his brothers. Albert, Duke of York, watched the pen move across the first copy and understood, with a certainty that settled in his chest like cold water, that he was about to become king. He was 41 years old. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a stammer so severe that speaking in public could leave him physically shaking. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, stood to one side. George, Duke of Kent, stood to the other. Neither spoke. The signatures took minutes. The room was quiet. When the last copy was signed, the brothers added their own names as witnesses, 3 men trained since childhood to stand where they were told. Outside, the December light was already failing. Inside, a family built on discipline and silence had just produced the only voluntary abdication in the history of the British crown. The world would call it a love story, a king who gave up the throne for the woman he loved. But inside that room, there was no romance. There was a family fractured decades in the making, and 3 brothers who already knew, because they had grown up in the same household, exactly what had caused it. This is the private story of George V's children, 6 sons, 1 daughter, and the father whose household made them. It spans 4 decades, 2 world wars, an abdication, a coronation, and a death at 13 in a farmhouse that most of the country never knew existed. But to understand how 4 brothers ended up in that room, how one came to sign away the throne, how another stood watching the weight of the crown settle on his own shoulders, how the younger 2 could do nothing but witness the unraveling of everything their father had built, you have to go back, not to the abdication, not to Wallace Simpson, not even to the war that remade the monarchy. You have to go back to a house in Norfolk, to a second son who never expected to be king, to a marriage built on duty rather than passion, and to the particular kind of father that combination produced. This is the story of a family that invented the modern British monarchy and spent a generation watching its own children break under the cost. It is the story of 6 sons and a daughter, of a name manufactured in wartime, of a household where fear was mistaken for preparation, and of what the surname Windsor meant to the people who had to carry it before the public ever heard it spoken. To begin with George V is to begin with a contradiction so complete that it takes a full century to see it clearly. The public version of this man, the version preserved in official portraits, in the court circular, in the biographies authorized during his lifetime and the commemorations that followed his death, is of a king who steadied the British crown through the most dangerous decades it had faced since the 17th century. He navigated the constitutional crisis over the House of Lords in 1911. He held the monarchy together through a world war that destroyed the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, and the Hohenzollerns. He managed the Irish question, the transformation of the empire into something approaching a commonwealth, the rise of a Labour government in 1924, and the general strike of 1926, all without provoking revolution, irrelevance, or a single serious Republican movement in mainland Britain. He made more than 450 visits to troops during the First World War and over 300 visits to hospitals. In 1915, he was thrown from his horse during an inspection of troops in France and fractured his pelvis, an injury that caused him pain for the rest of his life, and which he bore without public complaint because complaint was not something George V permitted himself or anyone near him. He was not glamorous. He was not charming in the way his father, Edward VII, had been charming. All appetite, sociability, mistresses, clubs, race courses, food, and pleasure. George V was punctual, narrow, conservative in dress and thought, suspicious of most forms of modernity, and the happiest when he was at Sandringham with his guns, his stamps, and his dogs. His stamp collection was not an idle hobby. It was one of the finest in the world, and he pursued it with the same meticulous attention he applied to everything he controlled. His daily routines were fixed. His preferences were absolute. His tolerance for deviation was negligible. And that, in a certain light, was precisely the point. He understood, perhaps better than any monarch before him, that the crown's survival in the 20th century depended not on spectacle but on sobriety, not on brilliance but on steadiness, not on being loved for excitement but on being trusted for reliability. The British public, shaken by war, by industrial unrest, by the sight of European monarchies toppling one after another, needed a king who looked like he would not fall. George looked like that. He was that. And the cost of being that and of building an entire public identity around discipline, control, and the suppression of anything that looked dangerous was paid not by the king but by his children. He was born on the 3rd of June, 1865, at Marlborough House in London, the second son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. His name was George Frederick Ernest Albert, and nothing in his early life suggested he would ever sit on the throne. That expectation belonged to his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie, a young man of uncertain health, uncertain temperament, and if the more candid accounts are to be believed, uncertain suitability for kingship. George was the spare. He was directed towards the Royal Navy at the age of 12, which suited his temperament entirely. Hierarchy, routine, discipline, order, the physical world of ships and seas, and chain of command rather than the drawing rooms and political salons that awaited a future king. He served from boyhood into young adulthood. He saw the world, or at least the parts of it that the British Empire administered, from the deck of a warship. The Navy gave him structure. It also gave him a particular understanding of authority that he would never revise, that command was not negotiable, that rules existed to be obeyed without discussion, and that sentiment was a private indulgence that had no place on a quarterdeck or later in a nursery. Then, in January 1892, Prince Albert Victor died of pneumonia during an influenza epidemic at Sandringham. He was 28 years old. George was 26. In a matter of days, the second son became the heir to the most powerful throne on earth. And with the inheritance of expectation came something else. Albert Victor's fiancée, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known as May. The engagement between May and Eddie had been a dynastic arrangement approved by Queen Victoria herself. After Eddie's death, the arrangement was redirected. There was no period of extended courtship. There was no question of May being released from the family's orbit to seek her own future. In July 1893, George married May at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. There is something about that transfer worth sitting with for a moment. She had been chosen for one brother and given to another. The crown required a bride, and she was suitable. Her feelings about the exchange, whether she grieved for Eddie, whether she was relieved, whether she simply understood that in the world of royal marriages one did not question what was required, are not fully recoverable from the historical record. What is clear is that she brought to the marriage a quality George needed and perhaps could not have found elsewhere. She understood monarchy not as a birthright to be enjoyed, but as an institution to be maintained, polished, and defended against every threat, including the threat of human feeling. Victoria Mary, and Queen Mary, as she would become, was born on the 26th of May, 1867. Her family, the Tecks, occupied an awkward position in the European royal network. Sufficiently royal in blood to be present at court, insufficiently wealthy to be comfortable. Her father, the Duke of Teck, had expensive tastes and limited resources. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was generous, popular, and financially chaotic. The family moved frequently, lived in borrowed houses, and depended on the goodwill of more secure relations. May grew up understanding something that many people born into the higher reaches of royalty never had to learn, that status was precarious, that appearances mattered not because they were pleasant, but because they were necessary, that the machinery of monarchy required constant attention to detail because without that attention, the whole enterprise could slip. She became, over the course of her life, one of the most formidable guardians of royal possessions, interiors, and ceremony the British crown has ever known. She catalogued, she collected, she organized. She understood which objects belonged in which rooms, which paintings had been moved by careless predecessors, which pieces of furniture carried historical significance. The Royal Collection Trust records her deep involvement with royal possessions. The inventories, the dealers, the museums, the careful organization of what the monarchy owned and what it displayed to itself and to the world. This was not mere acquisitiveness. It was a form of love expressed through control. The same instinct George applied to rules, Mary applied to things. Together they built a household that was immaculate, punctual, correct, and almost entirely devoid of the kind of warmth that allows children to feel safe making mistakes. They honeymooned at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and they would live there for the next 33 years. York Cottage was not a palace. It was a relatively modest country house, comfortable by upper middle class standards, almost absurdly small by royal ones. The rooms were low-ceilinged, the corridors were narrow, the garden was pleasant but unremarkable. A visitor expecting the grandeur of Balmoral or the scale of Windsor Castle would have been startled. But George loved it. He loved Sandringham. He loved the shooting, the routine, the predictability of country life, the sense that within these walls and these acres he was master of a world he could comprehend. York Cottage was not just his home. It was the projection of his temperament into bricks and mortar, contained orderly, resistant to excess, and uncomfortable with anything that did not fit. The crucial public transformation came in 1917, and it is the hinge on which the entire dynasty story turns. By the third year of the First World War, anti-German feeling in Britain had reached a pitch that threatened the monarchy itself. The royal family's name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, unmistakably, uncomfortably, fatally German. George's cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the enemy. The streets of London had seen anti-German riots. Shops with German-sounding names had been ransacked. Dachshunds had been kicked in the street. The royal household's German connections, which had been unremarkable in peacetime, were now politically lethal. The family was vulnerable in a way it had not been since the crises of the previous century, and this time the vulnerability was existential. The Russian Tsar, George's own first cousin, had been forced from his throne in March. The Habsburgs were disintegrating. The Hohenzollerns would fall within a year. Monarchy across Europe was dying, and the disease was partly the suspicion that kings were foreign, out of touch, and loyal to class rather than country. On the 17th of July, 1917, George V issued a royal proclamation declaring that the royal house and family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, and that all German styles, titles, and dignities held by members of the family would be relinquished. The name was chosen because it sounded solidly, unmistakably English. Windsor Castle, the River Thames at its feet, stone, history, and Englishness itself. In a single proclamation, the royal family ceased to be a branch of the European aristocratic network and became something new, a national family, British in name, British in image, British in the values it projected to a country at war. There is something about that decision that goes beyond a change of name. George did not simply rebrand the monarchy, he manufactured it. Windsor was not an inherited identity. It was an act of wartime camouflage that happened to become permanent, and the lesson George absorbed from its success, that image could save a dynasty, that appearances were not superficial, but structural, that what the public saw was more important than what the family felt, would poison his household for the next 2 decades. Once a man learns that survival depends on controlling the visible surface, he may teach his children that their private pain is subordinate to the family's public stability, that vulnerability is not simply unfortunate, it is dangerous, that weakness, in a family whose name exists to project strength, is a form of betrayal. 5 months after the renaming, in December 1917, George issued letters patent restricting the use of his or her Royal Highness and the designation prince or princess to the children of the sovereign's sons, and the eldest living son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. Everyone else in the extended royal family lost the style. George was pruning, cutting away excess, narrowing the definition of who counted as royal and who would be allowed to carry the name he had just invented. The public purpose was clarity and economy. The private effect was a household governed by a man who believed that survival depended on control, and that control meant deciding who belonged and who did not. That instinct would reach all the way into the nursery. Before the consequences of that instinct can be understood, the children who received it must become real. There were 6 who survived infancy, born between 1894 and 1905, and each entered the household at York Cottage under the same roof, the same parents, and the same unspoken code. Their divergent fates, abdication, reluctant kingship, quiet obedience, glamorous self-destruction, early death, and dutiful marriage are not accidents. They are the varied expressions of a single childhood, and each must be understood as an individual before the family's unraveling can be felt as fully as it deserves. The eldest was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, born on the 23rd of June, 1894 at White Lodge in Richmond Park. The family called him David. He was the heir from the moment his grandfather died in 1910, and long before that he was the child on whom the dynasty's entire future was supposed to rest. He was attractive, quick, charming in company, physically slight, and restless in a way that alarmed his father almost from the start. David did not want to sit still. He did not want to submit. He had an instinct for the modern, for jazz, for travel, for women, for informality, for a world that moved faster and cared less about precedents than the one his father governed. And George experienced that instinct not as vitality, but as instability. The father saw in the son everything the Windsor Project was designed to suppress: vanity, sensuality, emotional indulgence, a preference for pleasure over duty, and a dangerous inability to understand that the crown was not his to enjoy, but his to carry. Their relationship became a contest that would run for decades. George correcting, David evading, George tightening, David slipping away, George growing more contemptuous, David growing more dependent on the affection of anyone who was not his father. By the time the crisis arrived, David had spent a lifetime learning how to resist George V without ever learning how to stand on his own. The second son was Albert Frederick Arthur George, born on the 14th of December, 1895, at Sandringham, a date that carried its own private weight, being the anniversary of Prince Albert's death, the consort whose loss had defined Queen Victoria's reign. The family called him Bertie. Where David was bright, restless, and socially fluent, Bertie was sensitive, anxious, physically awkward, and afflicted from early childhood by a severe stammer that would define his public life and in many ways his private identity. He was also knock-kneed, subjected to corrective splints that caused him pain, and naturally left-handed in a household that insisted on right-handedness, forcing the correction of a tendency that modern medicine would have left alone. He suffered from chronic digestive complaints that may have been connected to the anxiety that pervaded his daily existence, a body in constant quiet revolt against the demands placed upon it. His stammer was not simply a speech impediment. It was the body's refusal to perform what the family demanded: fluency, control, the smooth public voice of a prince. Every time Bertie opened his mouth and the words would not come, he was failing in the one way his household could not tolerate: visibly. In a family that was organized entirely around the management of what the public saw and heard, a son who could not speak without the world hearing his fear was not merely unfortunate. He was, in his father's eyes, a problem. And his father, by multiple biographical accounts, responded to that problem not with patience, but with the same tool he applied to everything: discipline. The stammer was not understood as a medical condition requiring compassion. It was experienced inside the household as a humiliation, a flaw in the machinery of a dynasty that had just survived a world war by proving it could control its own image. That Bertie's body would one day become the vehicle for one of the most celebrated acts of courage in modern British history, a king forcing himself to speak to a nation at war, is a story that belongs to later in this narrative. For now, he was simply the second son, the one who could not get the words out. Princess Mary came next, born on the 25th of April, 1897, at Sandringham. The only daughter, she was trained into duty and discretion in the way that daughters of the British royal family were trained at the turn of the century. Not for the throne, but for marriage, service, charitable patronage, and the quiet maintenance of the family's public image. She was competent, loyal, and largely invisible in the way that suited the household's needs. She would marry Henry, Viscount Lascelles, at Westminster Abbey in February 1922, a marriage that fulfilled the dynastic expectation without drama, and a life that would be spent at Harewood House in Yorkshire, far from the crises her brothers would create. Her story is less dramatic than theirs, but it is no less shaped by the household that produced her. Mary learned containment. She learned that a woman's role in this family was to endure, to serve, and to keep whatever she felt behind a surface that the world could approve of. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was born on the 31st of March, 1900. He was the soldierly son, the third boy, the one who largely did what was expected. He pursued a military career, served with competence, and functioned throughout his life as the brother who neither rebelled spectacularly nor broke publicly. In the family drama that was coming, Henry would stand as a witness, present at the abdication, loyal to the institution, but never the center of the crisis. His obedience was its own kind of survival. It was also its own kind of erasure. To obey completely in a family like this was to disappear into the role without anyone asking what you might have wanted instead. Then came Prince George, Duke of Kent, born on the 20th of December, 1902. He was the most glamorous of the brothers, the one whose looks, social ease, and cultural interests set him apart from the naval and military mold that had shaped the others. He was artistically inclined, fashionable, charismatic in a way that attracted attention, and in later years, the kind of speculation that the family could not afford. Biographers and press accounts would associate him with private scandal, drug use, complex relationships, a social world that operated by different rules from those enforced at Sandringham. He married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in 1934, and for a time the marriage appeared to have stabilized him. But George's life carried a quality of recklessness that suggested the Windsor household had produced not only rebellion and stammering obedience, but also a third response to fear. The pursuit of sensation as escape, the search for relief in places the family code could not reach. He would die in an RAF crash near Dunbeath in Scotland on the 25th of August, 1942, at the age of 39. The plane went into a hillside called Eagle's Rock. There were no survivors among the crew except the rear gunner. George was the first member of the royal family to die on active service in over 500 years, and then there was Prince John, born on the 12th of July, 1905, at York Cottage, the youngest surviving child. Johnny, as the family called him, was a lively, affectionate boy who developed epilepsy in early childhood. The seizures worsened as he grew older. By 1916, when he was 11, he had been moved from the main household to Wood Farm, a smaller property on the Sandringham estate, under the care of his devoted governess, Charlotte Bill, known to the family and to Johnny as Lala. He disappeared from official photographs after about 1913. His formal education ended. His contact with the family became intermittent, visits rather than daily life, occasions rather than routine. He lived at the edge of the estate, loved by Lala Bill, tended by doctors who warned he might not reach adulthood, but no longer part of the picture the family presented to the world. There is something about Johnny's removal that must be understood not as cartoon cruelty, but as something more revealing. Wood Farm was not a dungeon. Lala Bill was not a jailer. Johnny was cared for, even loved, in the private world that was built around him. But he was separated. His illness did not fit the image. His seizures could not be controlled, and in a family that was organized around control, a child whose body refused to obey the rules of composure was a problem that could only be solved by distance. Johnny was 13 years old, and he was, in the quietest and most devastating way, the first evidence of what the House of Windsor did with vulnerability. It did not destroy it. It removed it from sight. The family was now complete, and the dynamics that would define everything were already taking shape inside the walls of York Cottage and the wider estate at Sandringham. George and Mary presided over a household that appeared from the outside to embody every domestic virtue the British public expected of its monarchy: stability, order, duty, devotion to routine, a reassuring absence of scandal. The official portraits showed a family that was serious but not severe, dignified but not distant. The nursery, the garden, the church on Sundays, the shooting in season, the punctual meals, the early bedtimes, the dogs, but everything about the public image suggested a family that functioned like the best kind of English household, scaled upward by the accident of birth, but essentially wholesome. The reality of the nursery was governed by a different logic. The children were raised not primarily by their parents, but by a succession of nannies, governesses, and tutors, the standard arrangement for families of this class and era, but one that in this household carried a particular emotional charge. George saw his children at appointed times. He inspected them. He corrected them. Mealtimes were occasions not for conversation, but for scrutiny. The right posture, the right manners, the right clothes, the right silence when silence was required, the right answer when a question was asked. A child who arrived late or dressed incorrectly or spoke out of turn or failed to meet the standard in any of the small daily ways that George monitored could expect not a quiet word but a reprimand delivered at a volume that the household staff could hear. The children learned early and permanently that their father's attention was something to be endured rather than sought, that love in this family was expressed as correction, and that the safest position in any room their father occupied was invisible. Inside the household, the code operated differently. George's discipline was not the gentle firmness of a reassuring father. By multiple biographical accounts, consolidated most recently in Jane Ridley's reassessment, he was a man of fierce temper who shouted at his household, who expected his children to stand at attention, literally and psychologically, and who treated any deviation from his standards as an offense not merely against manners, but against the survival of the dynasty itself. Whether or not he ever said the precise words attributed to him, My father was frightened of his mother. My mother was frightened of my father. And I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me. The sentence endured because it described something many people close to the family believed to be true. The attribution has been disputed. Kenneth Rose considered it almost certainly apocryphal. Randolph Churchill is cited as the source. But apocryphal quotations survive when they capture a reality that documented evidence supports but cannot quite articulate in a single sentence. George V's children were frightened of him. That much is not in dispute. Mary's role was more complex, and the script must resist the temptation to reduce her to coldness. She was not indifferent to her children. She was not unfeeling. But she had married into a system that demanded the suppression of private emotion in the service of public duty. And she had absorbed that demand so completely that it became indistinguishable from her own nature. She maintained the household. She preserved the rituals. She guarded the monarchy's possessions and ceremonies with extraordinary care. And she expected her children to understand, as she understood, that what they felt was less important than what they represented. She did not soften George's severity enough to protect the children from its effects. Whether any woman in her position, in that era, inside that particular code of royal conduct, could have stepped between a king and his sons, is a question that resists a simple answer. What can be said is that the children experienced a household in which the father commanded and the mother endured, and in which love, when it existed, came wrapped in so many layers of expectation and restraint that it could be difficult to distinguish from duty. The first signs of fracture were quite enough to miss if you were not living inside the household. David grew more restless, more resistant to his father's corrections, more drawn to the world outside the court, to people who did not demand that he stand straighter or speak differently or suppress whatever it was about himself that George found so alarming. Bertie's stammer deepened, and with it his anxiety, and with the anxiety came a withdrawal into the background that suited the household's needs, but cost the boy something that could not easily be measured. Mary learned silence and service, learned that what was expected of the daughter was not voice but compliance. Henry learned to obey without being noticed, which is its own form of disappearance. George, the youngest surviving son old enough to understand the household, learned charm, learned that if you could make people like you, if you could be entertaining and socially appealing, the rules could sometimes be bent. It was a strategy that would serve him in society and destroy him in private. And at Wood Farm, behind a screen of trees at the edge of the Sandringham estate, a little boy with epilepsy lived with his governess, while his family carried on as though the picture were complete. None of them knew yet what the next decade would bring. David did not know that a twice-divorced American woman would one day offer him something that felt like love and cost him the throne. Bertie did not know that an Australian speech therapist working from consulting rooms in Holly Street would teach him to breathe, to speak, to stand before a microphone and address a nation at war. Mary did not know that her marriage would take her to Yorkshire and away from the worst of the storm. Henry did not know that he would stand in a room at Fort Belvedere and watch his eldest brother sign away the crown. George did not know that a hillside in Scotland would end his life at 39. And Johnny did not know that he had less than 3 years left. The public saw the House of Windsor at its most secure. A wartime king who had renamed his dynasty and saved it. A dutiful queen who embodied the steadiness the country needed. A handsome heir who charmed the crowds. A respectable, seemingly united family. The family name had been saved. But one child at Sandringham was already showing what happened to weakness in this household. And what happened to weakness in the years ahead would determine the fate of every son George V had raised to fear him. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. The years between the renaming and the end of the First World War were, in public terms, the making of George V. He had entered the war as a king whose hold on the nation's affection was still being tested. He emerged from it as the most trusted monarch in Europe, the last man standing among the great royal houses, the sovereign who had survived where the Tsar, the Kaiser, and the Habsburg Emperor had not. His method was visibility without glamour. He did not command armies. He did not make strategic decisions. He did what a constitutional monarch in wartime was supposed to do. He showed up. He visited the troops more than 450 times over the course of the war. He visited hospitals, more than 300. He toured munitions factories. He spoke to the wounded, the bereaved, the exhausted. He gave up alcohol for the duration of the conflict, a gesture of solidarity with the temperance movement that was, by all accounts, personally painful for a man who enjoyed his evening whiskey. He allowed Buckingham Palace to follow rationing guidelines. He did everything in his power to make the monarchy appear not as an ornament perched above the suffering, but as a participant in it. The injury at the front in October 1915 was real. His horse, startled by cheering troops during an inspection in France, reared and fell on him. George fractured his pelvis. The pain was severe, and it never fully left him. It would trouble his health for the remaining 20 years of his life and contribute to the chronic discomfort that marked his later years. He did not publicize the injury. He bore it as he bore everything, privately, silently, with the same refusal to acknowledge weakness that he demanded of his children. There is something about that consistency worth noting. George V was not a hypocrite. He did not ask his sons to endure things he would not endure himself. He simply believed that endurance was the price of the position, that suffering was private, and that the world had no business seeing a king in pain. The problem was not the code itself. The problem was that he applied it to children who were not yet old enough to understand the difference between stoicism and emotional starvation. At Sandringham and at Buckingham Palace, the household settled into the rhythms that would define the family's best years, or at least the years that looked best from the outside. George's routine was immovable. He rose early. He attended to his correspondence and his red boxes with the precision of a man who believed that every document deserved the same attention, whether it concerned a constitutional matter or a question about the placement of a painting. He shot in season with an accuracy that was remarked upon even by those who found his company otherwise limited. He worked on his stamps in the evenings. He went to bed at a fixed hour. Mary matched his discipline with her own. She maintained the royal residences with the exacting eye of a museum curator. She oversaw the household social calendar, the charitable obligations, the visits, the presentations at court. Together, they projected an image of monarchy that was, for the first time in a generation, almost middle class in its values. Hard work, routine, respectability, family, church, and an absolute horror of anything that smelled of scandal. The children grew inside this image like plants trained against a wall, shaped by the structure, reaching for whatever light they could find within its constraints. David, as the Prince of Wales, was sent into public life earlier than his siblings. He served during the war, not in combat to his lasting frustration, but in staff positions that brought him close enough to the front to understand what the men in the trenches were enduring. He emerged from the war with a sympathy for the ordinary soldier and a restlessness with the formalities of the court life that would only deepen. His father saw in him not a young man changed by war, but a young man insufficiently changed, still too casual, still too interested in pleasure, still too unwilling to submit to the discipline that George believed was the only thing standing between the monarchy and destruction. The tension between them was not yet a crisis. It was a temperature, a permanent low-grade friction that everyone in the household could feel and no one was permitted to name. Bertie, meanwhile, served in the Royal Navy and later in the Royal Air Force. He was present at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916, one of the few members of the royal family to have experienced a major naval engagement. He was physically ill and seasickness, the digestive complaints that had plagued him since childhood. But he served. He did what was expected. He did not complain. His stammer, during these years, was a private burden more than a public one. The military did not require him to give speeches. It required him to follow orders, and following orders was something Bertie understood. The crisis of public speech was still ahead of him, waiting in the microphone age that would arrive with the 1920s. For now, he was the quiet second son, dutiful, unnoticed, doing his part in the shadow of an elder brother who absorbed all the light. Princess Mary threw herself into war work with the thoroughness her parents expected. She visited hospitals, supported charitable efforts, and began to build the public identity that would carry her through a life of service. Competent, loyal, uncontroversial, and almost entirely invisible in the historical record compared to her brothers. Henry was too young for the war, but old enough to absorb its atmosphere. The sense that duty was not optional, that service was the family's currency, and that anything less than total commitment to the institution was a form of betrayal. George, the youngest of the older children, was younger still, a boy growing up in a household that was simultaneously managing a world war and a domestic revolution in the crown's identity. The post-war years brought something that looked from certain angles like a reward. The monarchy had survived. Britain had won. The empire, though strained, was intact. George V presided over a country that was exhausted but victorious, and his own reputation had never been higher. The social world that surrounded the family, the world of country house weekends, the season in London, Ascot and Goodwood and cows, the presentations at court, the hierarchy of the peerage, the rituals of class and precedence, reassembled itself after the disruption of war with a determination that suggested nothing had fundamentally changed. The great houses reopened. The debutantes were presented. The court circular recorded the movements of the royal family with the same meticulous attention it had always applied. At Sandringham, the rhythms of shooting, dining, and domestic routine continued as though the trenches of Flanders had been a temporary interruption rather than a civilizational rupture. George liked it that way. He liked the orderliness of a world that knew its place, where titles meant something, where the machinery of social position functioned as it had for generations. He was a conservative man living through a period of radical change, and his response to change was always the same: hold tighter, keep the routine, maintain the surface. If the surface holds, the rest will follow. And Johnny remained at Wood Farm. The war years, which brought the rest of the family into heightened public visibility, pushed him further into seclusion. His seizures were worsening. The doctors who attended him offered management, not cure. There was no cure in that era for the kind of epilepsy Johnny suffered. Lala Bill cared for him with a devotion that the family itself could not match, not because they did not love him, but because their love operated inside a system that had no room for a child, whose condition could not be hidden, managed, or disciplined into submission. Johnny's world shrank as his family's world expanded. He had his governess, his garden, his animals, his small routines at the edge of the estate. He did not appear in the official photographs that marked the war years. He was not part of the story the family told the nation. He was, in the most literal sense, the child the public was not meant to see. There is a temptation in telling this part of the story to rush towards the crisis, to jump ahead to the abdication, to Wallace Simpson, to the moment the whole structure collapsed. But the years between the end of the war and the middle 1920s are essential, because they are the years when the cracks that would eventually destroy the family's unity were forming under the surface, invisible to anyone who was not living inside the household. The public saw a family at its peak. The family was experiencing something rather different. George V's severity did not soften with the end of the war. If anything, it intensified. The post-war world was unstable. Revolution in Russia, upheaval in Ireland, the rise of labor, the general strike of 1926, the erosion of the old certainties that had governed British public life for a century. George responded to instability the only way he knew how, with tighter control. The household became more rigid. The expectations became more exacting. The punishments for falling short became more immediate and more frightening. Jane Ridley's biography, the most recent major reassessment of George V, portrays a man renowned for a fiery temper, who shouted at everyone around him and argues that his bullying of the children had real and lasting consequences, particularly for David, Bertie, and George, Duke of Kent. This is interpretive, as all biographical claims about private households must be, but it is supported by a weight of contemporary observation and family memoir that makes it difficult to dismiss. The daily reality for the children was not dramatic violence. It was something more pervasive and harder to escape. The knowledge that their father's attention was a form of interrogation, that his love was conditional on performance, and that the performance required was not excellence but submission. George inspected his children the way he had once been inspected as a naval officer. Their posture, their dress, their punctuality, their manners, their speech, their willingness to conform to standards that left no room for individuality, let alone vulnerability. A crooked tie could provoke a reprimand. A late arrival could provoke fury. A stammer could provoke something that looked to the child experiencing it like contempt. The children learned to manage their father the way one manages a dangerous weather system, by reading the signs, by staying out of range when the pressure was rising, by making themselves as small and as correct as possible, and by understanding that the safest response to any parental interaction was obedience so immediate and so total that it left no opening for criticism. David, now the Prince of Wales and the most famous young man in the British Empire, was touring the world on behalf of the Crown, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and being adored by millions. He was handsome, informal, apparently modern, apparently caring. He shook hands with veterans. He danced with women who were not aristocrats. He wore clothes that his father considered inappropriate, suits that were too fashionable, ties that were too bold, an overall appearance that suggested the heir to the throne was more interested in being liked than in being respected. He radiated a quality of ease that George found not charming but threatening, because ease suggested that the crown could be carried lightly, and George knew in his bones that the crown could not be carried lightly. It could only be carried with discipline, and discipline meant fear, and fear meant control, and any son who did not understand that was a son who would sooner or later drop it. The relationship between George and David became, in these years, a pattern that would repeat until it destroyed them both. George criticized, David withdrew. George criticized the withdrawal. David sought warmth elsewhere, in the company of older married women who offered him the tenderness his family did not. George heard about the women and was appalled, not only because the relationships were improper, but because they confirmed everything he feared about his eldest son, that David was weak, that he was governed by emotion, that he could not be trusted with the one thing that mattered. The more George pushed, the further David retreated. The further David retreated, the more George pushed. Neither of them could break the cycle because neither of them understood it as a cycle. George believed he was correcting a deficiency. David believed he was surviving a tyrant. They were both right. Bertie, during these same years, was navigating a quieter but equally painful version of the family code. His stammer had not improved. It had, if anything, worsened as the demands of public life increased. He was now Duke of York, a title that carried expectations of public appearance, public speech, and public competence. He attended events, he opened things. He represented the crown at occasions that required him to stand before a room of people and speak. And every time he did, the words caught in his throat, the pauses stretched, the audience shifted uncomfortably, and Bertie felt the failure in his body like a physical blow. He had tried various treatments, none had worked. The stammer was not a simple mechanical problem. It was tangled up with anxiety, with the memory of his father's contempt, with the knowledge that every time he opened his mouth, he was confirming the household's worst suspicion about him, that he was not adequate to the role, that his body had betrayed the family in the one way that mattered most in the age of public speech. And then, on the 18th of January, 1919, the family's private code produced its first undeniable casualty. Prince John had spent Christmas Day, 1918, with the family at Sandringham. The war had ended 6 weeks earlier, on the 11th of November. The household was gathered for the first peacetime Christmas in 5 years. The decorations were up. The rituals were observed. The family sat together in the way that families do at Christmas. The table laid, the food served. The occasion demanding at least the appearance of togetherness. And Johnny was there, briefly, conditionally, in the way that the family system permitted. He was 13 years old. His seizures were frequent and severe. His world had narrowed to Wood Farm, to Lullabill, to the garden, to the animals he loved, and to the occasional visits from a family that could not accommodate what his illness demanded. He had not lived in the main house for more than 2 years. His formal education had ended. The doctors had warned that the seizures were likely to worsen, that his condition was deteriorating, that there was a limit to what medicine could do. After the Christmas celebrations, Johnny was driven back to Wood Farm. That was the arrangement. He could be present for the day, but he could not stay. His condition made his presence unpredictable. A seizure at the dinner table, a collapse in front of guests, an episode that could not be managed within the careful choreography of the royal household. And unpredictability was the one thing this family could not tolerate. The car took him back along the estate roads, through the Norfolk darkness, to the farmhouse where Lullabill was waiting. Christmas night at Wood Farm. A boy and his governess. The main house lit up behind them. 3 weeks later, on the night of January the 18th, Johnny suffered a severe seizure in his sleep at Wood Farm. Layla Bill was with him. The seizure was catastrophic. He did not recover. Prince John died that night in his bed at the age of 13, with his governess beside him and his family a short distance away across the Sandringham estate. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that the death was a great shock, and that the boy looked very peaceful lying there. Those words, recorded by Royal Central from the diary, carry the whole weight of the family's emotional language. A great shock. He looked peaceful. The grief is real. The restraint is absolute. There is no rage, no howl, no questioning of the system that placed a dying child in a farmhouse at the edge of the estate, while the rest of the family lived in the main house. There is acceptance. There is the language of a woman who has been trained to absorb loss, the way she absorbs everything else, with composure, with dignity, with the understanding that private devastation must not be allowed to disturb the public surface. George V's response, as recorded by those around him, was similarly contained. He was not unfeeling. The loss of a child is the loss of a child, regardless of how the household was organized. But there is no record of the death prompting any re examination of the family's treatment of Johnny. No suggestion that his removal to Wood Farm had been a mistake. No acknowledgement that the system itself might have contributed to his isolation. The machinery of the household absorbed the death. The way it absorbed everything, it continued. The funeral was small. The public notice was brief. The official mourning was appropriate and limited, and then the family moved on. Each child experienced Johnny's death differently, and the differences revealed the fault lines that were already forming. David, at 24, was old enough to understand the death as part of the family's pattern, the disposal of inconvenience, the management of image, the insistence that the visible surface remain undisturbed no matter what was happening beneath it. Whether he connected Johnny's fate to his own growing resistance to the family code is impossible to know with certainty, but the lesson was available to anyone paying attention. In this family, if you could not perform what was expected of you, you would be moved to the margins. Bertie, at 23, absorbed the death more quietly. He was the sibling whose own body had already taught him what it meant to be inadequate in his father's eyes, and Johnny's removal, the years of seclusion, the gradual disappearance from the family portrait, was a version of the fate Bertie must have feared for himself. Not exile to a farmhouse, but the internal exile of being the son who stammered, the son who could not speak, the son whose weakness was visible every time he opened his mouth. Princess Mary, at 21, processed the loss through the lens of duty, the same lens through which she would process everything for the rest of her life. Henry and George, at 18 and 16, were young enough to experience the death as atmosphere rather than analysis. They knew that a brother had died. They knew that the family had continued. They absorbed the lesson without necessarily being able to articulate it, that grief in this household was something you carried privately, and that the world outside the family walls must never see you carrying it. The most devastating thing about Johnny's death was not the death itself. It was the fact that the family's emotional system did not change because of it. No one publicly rethought the code. No one questioned whether the suppression of vulnerability had gone too far. The household did not soften. George did not become a gentler father. Mary did not become a more demonstrative mother. The machinery of Windsor, discipline, image, control, the relentless management of what the public saw, the ground on. Johnny's death proved that the system could absorb the loss of a child without altering its fundamental operation. And if it could absorb that, it could absorb anything. Or so the family believed. In the years that followed, the household settled into a pattern that was, on its surface, entirely stable. The monarchy's public reputation continued to strengthen. George V was the most respected sovereign in Europe, the man who had held the crown together while empires fell, who had renamed his dynasty and made it survive, who had shown the British public that monarchy could be both dutiful and modern, at least in appearance. The Prince of Wales was the most popular young man in the empire, greeted on his tours by crowds so large and so enthusiastic that his handlers sometimes feared for his safety. The Duke of York was the quiet, dutiful second son who represented the family at functions without attracting attention or scandal. Princess Mary married Henry, Viscount Lascelles, in February 1922 at Westminster Abbey, a wedding attended by vast crowds, covered exhaustively by the press, and celebrated as exactly the kind of public occasion the monarchy was designed to provide. The bridegroom was 15 years Mary's senior, wealthy owner of Harewood House in Yorkshire, and possessed of the kind of temperament that would not have been out of place in her father's household, reserved, formal, and not given to displays of emotion. Whether Mary loved him or simply understood that love was not the primary consideration in a royal marriage is a question that belongs to her alone. What is clear is that the marriage removed her from the immediate orbit of her parents' household and placed her in a world that was, in its own way, equally governed by expectation and restraint. She would spend her life at Harewood, involved in charitable work, in the duties of her position as Princess Royal, and in the quiet endurance of whatever her private life contained. She rarely spoke about it. Henry pursued his military career with the steady competence that defined him. George, Duke of Kent, was growing into the most socially adventurous of the brothers, drawn to parties, to fashionable people, to a world of nightclubs, cocktails, and acquaintances that would have appalled his father if he had known the full extent of it. He was still young enough, in the early 1920s, for his social life to be regarded as youthful exuberance rather than a warning sign. But those who watched him closely could already see something that the family preferred not to acknowledge: that George's appetite for the company of certain people, for substances that dulled the edges of whatever he was feeling, and for experiences that took him as far as possible from the emotional constraints of Sandringham, was not a passing phase. It was a pattern. And patterns in this family had consequences that took years to become visible. That would change. The family, to anyone looking from the outside, was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. But the private dynamics were hardening into positions from which none of them would be able to retreat. David's relationships with women, older women, married women, women who offered him the emotional refuge his family denied, were becoming a pattern that alarmed the court even if the public did not yet know about it. George V's contempt for his eldest son was deepening into something that friends and courtiers would later describe as close to despair. He reportedly told Stanley Baldwin at some point during these years that after his death, the boy would ruin himself within 12 months. The exact phrasing has been attributed and disputed. Wikiquote cites Middlemass and Barnes's biography of Baldwin, but this sentiment is consistent across sources. George V looked at his heir and saw catastrophe. He also told People, in a line attributed by Philip Ziegler to his official biography of Edward VIII, that he hoped his eldest son would never marry and have children, and that nothing would come between Bertie, Lilibet, and the throne. Whether those were his exact words or a distillation of his known anxieties, the meaning was clear. The King of England had lost faith in his own heir, and the heir, who could feel that loss of faith in every interaction with his father, was responding the only way he knew how, by turning away from the institution that rejected him and towards anyone who would accept him as he was. Bertie, meanwhile, was approaching the moment that would define the first act of his public life. He was Duke of York now, married since April 1923 to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a woman whose warmth, common sense, and emotional intelligence would prove to be the single most important stabilizing force in his life. Elizabeth had not been raised in the royal household. She came from the Scottish aristocracy, Glamis Castle, the Bowes-Lyon family, a world that was privileged but not imprisoned by the peculiar demands of the crown. She brought to the marriage something Bertie had never had: the experience of being loved without condition, of being accepted without performance, of being valued for who he was rather than who he was supposed to be. Their marriage would prove to be one of the most consequential in modern British history, not because it was arranged, but because it was genuinely sustaining. But Elizabeth's love could not cure the stammer. And the stammer, by the middle 1920s, was no longer a private embarrassment, it was a public crisis. The microphone age had arrived. Radio was transforming public life. The king's voice, and the voices of his family, could now be heard by millions. A prince who could not speak fluently was a prince who could not function in the modern world. And the modern world was arriving whether George V approved of it or not. The British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1925 would make that failure devastatingly, inescapably public. Bertie was required to give a closing speech at the exhibition. It was a significant occasion. It's a celebration of the empire's achievements, attended by dignitaries, covered by the press, broadcast to a national audience. He stood before the crowd. The microphone was in front of him, the text was prepared, and the words would not come. They caught in his throat, tangled in the muscle spasms that Lionel Log would later identify as the physical mechanism of his block. The pauses stretched, 2 seconds, 3, 5, each one an eternity, for the man standing at the podium and for the audience watching him struggle. The dignitaries looked at their hands. The press recorded it. The radio carried the silence into living rooms across the country. The audience watched a prince fight his own body for control of his voice, and the body won. The humiliation was total, public, and impossible to explain away. It was not a bad day. It was not nerves. It was the visible, audible evidence of a wound that had been forming since childhood. Since the corrections, the splints, the forced right handedness, the father's fury, the household's insistence that weakness was failure and failure was betrayal. Bertie was 30 years old. He had endured his stammer for as long as he could remember. And now the entire empire had heard it. Johnny had disappeared from the public picture because his body could not obey the image. 6 years later, in front of an empire exhibition crowd, Bertie's body failed him in the same way. And the question that nobody in the family had been willing to ask, and what this household was doing to its children, was about to be answered by a man from Adelaide who had never set foot in a palace. Lionel Log was born on the 26th of February, 1880, in Adelaide, South Australia. He was not a doctor. He was not a member of the British establishment. He had no royal connections, no aristocratic credentials, and no particular reason to believe that his life would ever intersect with the British crown. He was a speech therapist, or more precisely, an elocution teacher who had developed his methods through years of practical work with returned soldiers suffering from shell shock, men whose voices had been broken by the trenches, the same way their nerves had. He had come to London in 1924, set up a practice in Harley Street, and built a reputation for treating stammers that other specialists had given up on. His methods were unconventional. He worked on breathing, on relaxation, on the physical tension in the jaw and throat and diaphragm that he believed was the mechanical cause of most speech blocks. He was informal in manner, direct in speech, and possessed of a confidence in his own approach that could appear to the more cautious members of the medical establishment as something close to arrogance. He called his patients by their first names. He expected to be treated as an equal. He operated entirely outside the world of deference, hierarchy, and institutional caution that defined everything the Duke of York had ever known. There is something about Log that must be understood before the story can continue. He was not simply a technician who fixed a broken voice. He was the first person in Bertie's adult life who treated the stammer not as a failure of character, but as a physical condition that could be addressed, not through willpower, not through discipline, not through the kind of brute force endurance that George V would have prescribed, but through patience, technique, and the radical suggestion that the Duke of York might benefit from being listened to rather than corrected. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records that Log relaxed the tension, causing the muscle spasms behind the stammer, that the Duke's impediment diminished to occasional hesitations, and that by 1927, Bertie was able to open the Australian Parliament in Canberra without stuttering. Those are the facts. The emotional reality beneath them is larger. Bertie came to Log in late 1926, after Elizabeth, always Elizabeth, who understood before anyone else that her husband needed help he could not find within the family, arranged the consultation. By then, Bertie had tried multiple treatments. He had seen specialists in London who had applied various techniques, some physical, some psychological, none of which had produced lasting improvement. One had told him to fill his mouth with marbles, an approach that would have been farcical if the desperation behind it had not been so real. Another had focused on breathing exercises that helped in the consulting room, but collapsed under the pressure of a public engagement. The Wembley humiliation was still recent enough to sting, not just as a memory, but as a prophecy of every future occasion when the Duke of York would be required to stand before people and speak. The prospect of further public speaking engagements, inevitable for a man in his position, a man whose role required him to open buildings, address charities, represent the crown at functions where silence was not an option, filled him with a dread that was by this point indistinguishable from physical illness. He arrived at Log's consulting rooms in Harley Street expecting another failure. He had been failing at this for 30 years. What he found was something entirely different. Log's first requirement was that they meet as equals. He would call the Duke Bertie. The Duke would call him Log, or eventually Lionel. This was not a small thing. It was, within the social architecture of the British royal household, almost revolutionary. Bertie had spent his entire life inside a system of hierarchy so rigid that even his own family addressed each other with formality in public. Log dismantled that hierarchy in the consulting room because he believed correctly, as it turned out, that the stammer was partly sustained by the very deference and anxiety that the royal system produced. The Duke could not speak freely because he had never been in a room where he was free. Log's rooms in Harley Street became that room. The treatment was physical and psychological at once. Log taught Bertie to breathe differently, to use his diaphragm rather than his chest, to control the flow of air that carried the voice. He worked on the muscle tension in the jaw and throat that locked the words in place. He had Bertie practice vowel sounds, tongue exercises, rhythmic speech patterns. But beneath the technique was something more fundamental. The experience of being with another person who did not flinch at the stammer, who did not look away during the pauses, who did not treat the Duke's difficulty as a source of shame. Log was patient without being pitying. He was demanding without being punitive. He expected improvement, and he communicated that expectation, not through the language of duty and discipline that Bertie had heard all his life, but through a kind of cheerful, practical optimism that was entirely foreign to the York Cottage code. The progress was gradual but real. The pauses shortened. The blocks became less frequent. Bertie began to speak with something that, for the first time in his life, approached fluency. Not perfect, not effortless, but functional, manageable, sufficient. The treatment required sustained commitment. Log gave Bertie exercises to practice daily, breathing patterns, tongue positions, ways of approaching difficult consonants that the Duke had learned to fear. Elizabeth supported the work at home, creating an environment in which the exercises were not an embarrassment but a project they shared. The improvement was not linear. There were setbacks, bad days, occasions when the old terror reasserted itself and the words locked in his throat as they always had. But the trajectory was upward, and Log's patience was inexhaustible. By the time Bertie was required to open the Australian Parliament in Canberra in 1927, during a royal tour with Elizabeth, he was able to deliver the speech without the catastrophic breakdown that had defined Wembley. The improvement was noticed. The press reported it with something close to astonishment. The Duke of York, who had been a figure of private sympathy and public awkwardness, was suddenly a man who could stand before a parliament and speak. Elizabeth knew what it had cost, the hours of practice, the vulnerability of submitting to treatment, the courage required to stand up again after Wembley and try. Log knew something deeper, that what he had given Bertie was not merely a technical fix for a speech impediment. He had given him the first sustained experience of his adult life in which a man in authority had responded to his vulnerability with help rather than punishment. That distinction between a father who treated weakness as an offense and a therapist who treated it as a problem to be solved, but would carry Bertie through everything that was coming. It was, in its quiet way, the most important relationship of his life outside his marriage. The book that would later tell this story most memorably, Mark Log and Peter Conrady's The King's Speech, drawn from Lionel Log's own diaries and archive, describes what its title page calls the torment the future king suffered at the hands of his father, George V, because of his stammer. That phrasing is strong, and the script should note that it represents the perspective of the Log family archive rather than an uncontested historical consensus. But the core claim that George V's response to his son's stammer compounded rather than alleviated the condition is consistent with everything the biographical record shows about the household. Bertie's stammer was not caused by his father, but it was made worse by a father who could not distinguish between a medical condition and a moral failing. And it was healed, or at least managed, quietened, brought under something approaching control, by a man who could. While Bertie was learning to breathe in Harley Street, David was learning nothing at all. The Prince of Wales, by the late 1920s, was the most celebrated bachelor in the world and the most privately troubled member of the family. His public image, and handsome, informal, caring, modern, had made him the subject of adoration wherever the empire sent him. Women wanted him, men admired him, crowds surged to see him. The press treated him as a figure of almost cinematic glamour, the young prince who had been touched by the war and emerged with a common touch that his father entirely lacked. But the private David was a man whose emotional life was organized around a single, repeating pattern. He sought out women who would dominate him, and when he found them, he surrendered to them with a completeness that alarmed everyone who cared about the succession. His relationships before Wallace Simpson were not casual. They were intense, consuming, and almost uniformly directed towards women who were older, married, and unavailable in ways that made the attachment both urgent and impossible. Freda Dudley Ward, the wife of a Liberal member of Parliament, was the most significant of these relationships, a connection that lasted through most of the 1920s and was known to the court, to the government, and to George V himself. Freda was warm, practical, maternal in a way that the York Cottage nursery had never been. and David's devotion to her was absolute in the manner of a man who has found the emotional anchor his childhood denied him. He telephoned her constantly. He wrote to her with a desperation that his friends found alarming. He organized his life around her availability. When she was not there, he was adrift. When she was there, he was calm. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look at it honestly. The Prince of Wales was a man who could not function without a woman to depend upon, and the women he chose were always women who could manage him, who could tell him what to wear, what to say, how to behave, who could provide the structure that his father had imposed through fear and that David now sought through love. After Frida came Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, American-born, glamorous, part of the social world that David increasingly inhabited when he was not on official duty. Thelma was less maternal than Frida, more socially ambitious, and it was through Thelma that David would meet Wallace. The connections between these women, the way each one led to the next, each relationship slightly more intense and more impossible than the last, trace a trajectory that was not random but inevitable. David was searching for something specific, and each attachment brought him closer to the woman who would provide it in its most concentrated and destructive form. The king's response was predictable: fury, contempt, the deepening conviction that his eldest son was not merely irresponsible, but constitutionally incapable of the restraint that monarchy demanded. George did not see a lonely young man seeking tenderness. He saw a future king who could not control his appetites. An appetite, and in the vocabulary of the Windsor household, was indistinguishable from weakness. The psychological dynamic is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains everything that would happen next. David had been raised by a father who expressed love as correction and whose approval was available only on terms of total submission, terms that David could never meet because meeting them would have required the obliteration of whatever remained of his individual self. The women David sought were not submissive partners. They were strong, controlling, emotionally commanding presences who told him what to do, what to wear, how to behave, who provided the framework of authority that he could not live without but could no longer accept from his father. The pattern is not subtle. A man raised under the absolute authority of a tyrannical father spent his adult life seeking the same quality of authority in romantic partners, but recoded intimacy as choice, as love rather than duty. What David wanted was not freedom from control. It was a different kind of control, one that came with affection attached, one that did not make him feel small, one that did not remind him, with every interaction, that he was inadequate to the name he carried. And when Wallace Simpson entered his life, she would provide exactly that, and the authority, the command, the management of his daily existence, with a precision that no one before her had matched. But that was still ahead. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the family's trajectories were diverging in the ways that the public could not yet see, but the court was beginning to understand. David's position as heir was increasingly shadowed by private anxiety about his suitability. Bertie's recovery from the worst of his stammer had given him a fragile but real public competence, and his marriage to Elizabeth had produced, in April 1926, a daughter, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, called Lilibet, the child who would one day become Elizabeth II. A second daughter, Princess Margaret Rose, followed in August 1930. The Duke and Duchess of York were building, in their quiet way, the kind of domestic stability that the senior line could not. George V noticed. His comment about nothing coming between Bertie, Lilibet, and the throne was not merely a wish. It was a reading of the situation that was, as events would prove, devastatingly accurate. Princess Mary, at Harewood, was living the life the family had designed for her, dutiful, charitable, largely out of the public eye. Her marriage to Viscount Lascelles had produced 2 sons, George and Gerald, and her domestic world was stable in the way that stability often looks when it has been purchased at the cost of personal ambition. She was the Princess Royal, the only daughter, the woman who had absorbed the family code so completely that she rarely appeared in the narrative except as a presence at ceremonies and a name in the court circular. Her silence was not emptiness, it was discipline. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, continued in his military career, reliable and unremarkable. He would marry Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott in November 1935, a late marriage by the standards of his generation, and the union would be solid without being notable. Henry's role in the family was to be present and to cause no trouble. He fulfilled it with a thoroughness that left almost no biographical trace. He was the brother whose obedience was so complete that it became invisible, the Windsor son who survived by never giving his father a reason to notice him. George, Duke of Kent, was traveling a different path entirely. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, his social life had crossed lines that the family could no longer explain away as youthful indiscretion. The associations with drugs, cocaine was later alleged by biographers and press accounts, the relationships that defied easy categorization, the parties that took him far from the controlled world of Sandringham and into a London that operated after dark and below the surface of respectable society. All of this was known to the family, or at least suspected. His marriage to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in November 1934 was, in part, an attempt at stabilization. Marina was beautiful, cultured, European, and possessed of the kind of royal dignity that the family hoped would anchor George to something more sustainable than the life he had been living. For a time, it appeared to work. They had 3 children. They presented well. The public saw a glamorous royal couple. The private reality was more complicated, as it always was in this family. George, Duke of Kent, was the son whose rebellion did not take the form of constitutional crisis. It took the form of self-destruction, dressed in evening clothes, and the family's response to his difficulties was the same response it had applied to Johnny's epilepsy, to Bertie's stammer, to David's women. Manage the surface, contain the damage, keep the visible image intact, and hope that what happens behind it does not break through. And then Wallace Simpson arrived. The official royal biography records that Edward met and fell in love with Wallace Simpson in 1930. She was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on the 19th of June, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, though she grew up in Baltimore, in circumstances that were genteel but not wealthy, dependent on the support of relatives after her father's early death. She had been married twice, first to Earl Winfield Spencer, a United States Navy pilot whose drinking made the marriage untenable, and then to Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American businessman with whom she had settled in London. She was attractive without being beautiful, sharp-witted, socially ambitious, immaculately dressed, and possessed of a directness that Edward found intoxicating and George V found appalling. She understood men. She understood power. She understood what it meant to manage someone, and she managed Edward with a competence that Freda Dudley Ward had applied gently and that Wallace applied with something closer to command. She was also, by every standard that mattered to the British establishment, the Church of England, which did not recognize divorce and whose supreme governor was the monarch, the court, which could not present a twice-divorced woman, the cabinet, which understood the constitutional impossibility, the dominions, whose consent was required for any change to the succession, absolutely impossible as a queen consort. Twice divorced, American, without title, without significant fortune, without the social credentials that might have softened the other deficiencies. She was, in the vocabulary of the 1930s British establishment, unsuitable. And Edward wanted her with a ferocity that made every previous attachment look like a rehearsal. The early years of the relationship were not yet a crisis. They were a gathering storm. Edward was still Prince of Wales. George V was still alive, still on the throne, still watching his eldest son with a mixture of fury and dread that was, by this point, the dominant emotion of his private life. The court knew about Wallace before the country did. That phrase is important because the British press exercised a self-imposed restraint about the relationship that would be unimaginable today. A gentleman's agreement between Fleet Street and the palace that kept the Prince of Wales' private life out of the newspapers, even as foreign publications covered it openly. American and European readers knew what was happening. The British public, for the most part, did not. The court, the cabinet, and the dominions existed in a state of informed anxiety. Watching the heir to the throne organize his emotional life around a woman whose presence on the throne was constitutionally and socially unthinkable, and hoping with diminishing conviction that the problem would resolve itself before it became a constitutional emergency. George V's health was declining. The injuries from the 1915 riding accident, the chronic bronchial problems that had troubled him for years, the severe septicemia that had nearly killed him in the late 1928, all of it was catching up with him. He had never fully recovered from that illness, which had kept him bedridden for months and forced a council of state to be appointed for the first time in his reign. He was 70 years old in 1935, the year of his silver jubilee, and this celebration surprised even him. The public response was enormous. Crowds filled the streets of London. Bunting hung from windows in the East End. Working-class neighborhoods that George had never expected to care about the monarchy turned out in numbers that moved him in a way that those close to him had rarely witnessed. He was reported to have said, with genuine bewilderment, that he could not understand it, that he was just an ordinary fellow. The affection was genuine, and it confirmed what George had spent his life believing, that the monarchy survived not through glamour, but through steadiness, not through charm, but through presence. He had been present, he had been steady, and the country, in its own way, had noticed. It was, by most accounts, the happiest period of his public life, but privately, the shadow was lengthening. The Jubilee crowds could not change what was happening inside the family. George watched David's attachment to Wallace with something that went beyond anger into a kind of anticipatory grief. The grief of a father who sees in his son's choices the confirmation of his deepest fear. The thing he had built, the House of Windsor, the disciplined, sober, nationally rooted monarchy that had survived a world war, the fall of 3 emperors, the Irish question, the rise of labor, and the transformation of the empire, was going to be undone by the son he had spent a lifetime trying to shape. The prophecy he had reportedly made to Stanley Baldwin hardened from anxiety into certainty. After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. Whether those were his exact words or a compression of many private conversations, Wikiquote cites Middlemas and Barnes's biography of Baldwin, the meaning was unchanged. George V believed his eldest son would destroy himself, and he believed it because he had spent 30 years watching David resist every lesson the household tried to teach him. He had also expressed, in a line attributed by Philip Ziegler, the hope that David would never marry or have children, and that nothing would come between Bertie, Lilibet, and the throne. The King of England was looking past his own eldest son. He was looking at the granddaughter, a little girl of 9, and seeing in her the future that David could not be trusted to provide. The relationship between the king's declining health and the heir's deepening attachment to Wallace Simpson created a timeline that everyone close to the situation could feel tightening. George was dying, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the slow, grinding way that chronic illness takes a man apart. His breathing worsened through 1935 and into the winter. His energy faded. The bronchial problems that had plagued him for years became more persistent, more debilitating, leaving him gaunt and short of breath in a way that could no longer be concealed from those who saw him regularly. He still worked. He still appeared at the events the calendar demanded. He still maintained the routine that had been the scaffolding of his entire reign, the red boxes, the audiences, the punctual meals, the stamps, the dogs. But those who saw him daily could see the erosion. The king was 70. He looked older. The pelvis injury from 1915 still caused him pain. The near-fatal septicemia of 1928 had never fully released its hold on his constitution. He was a man held together by habit and will, and both were running out. And behind him, waiting with an impatience that the court found distasteful and the government found alarming, was a Prince of Wales who had organized his entire emotional life around a woman who could not be queen. David was not ready. He had never been ready. Not in the way his father meant it, ready to subordinate himself entirely to the institution, ready to accept that the crown was not a privilege but a prison, ready to understand that personal happiness was irrelevant to the obligations of the throne. But now, with George's health failing and the question of succession no longer abstract but imminent, the full dimensions of David's unreadiness became visible to everyone who was paying attention. He did not attend to his duties with the diligence the government expected. He did not treat state papers with the seriousness they required. There were reports later confirmed the confidential documents had been left lying around at Fort Belvedere where Wallace and her social circle could see them. He spent time with Wallace that should have been spent preparing for the role he was about to inherit. The court saw a man who did not want the throne. The government saw a man who might be incapable of holding it. And Wallace, who was still married to Ernest Simpson, who had not yet begun the divorce proceedings that would bring the crisis to its climax, was not going away. The government's private anxiety was compounded by intelligence reports and diplomatic gossip suggesting that Wallace's associations included people whose political sympathies were, at best, questionable. Whether those concerns were justified or exaggerated by establishment prejudice against an outsider is a question that historians continue to debate. What is not debatable is that the Prince of Wales's private life had become a matter of state security as well as constitutional propriety, and the man at the center of the crisis seemed incapable of understanding what was at stake. Each of the siblings had arrived by this point at a position from which retreat was impossible. Bertie, Duke of York, had built a life he loved. Elizabeth, the two girls, the quiet competence of second son duties, the gradual improvement of his speech under Log's care, and the prospect of inheriting the throne terrified him precisely because he understood what it would cost. He had spent years learning to manage his fear. The throne would require him to live inside it permanently. David was moving in the opposite direction, not towards the institution, but away from it, drawn by an attachment so consuming that the throne itself had become an obstacle to the only thing he actually wanted. Mary at Harewood was insulated from the worst of the crisis by geography and temperament, but she understood what was coming. She had been raised in the same household, she knew her brothers, she knew what her father's death would mean for the family's fragile stability. Henry was preparing for his own marriage to Lady Alice Montague, Douglas Scott, a union that would proceed with the quiet appropriateness the family required while the senior line lurched towards catastrophe. And George, Duke of Kent, newly married to Marina, appeared to have stabilized. But the appearance was still being tested, and those who knew him well understood that stability for George was always provisional. Something would have to give. The only question, by the last weeks of 1935, was whether the old king would live long enough to see it, or whether the crisis would detonate after his death in the hands of a son who had never learned how to carry anything heavier than his own desire. The paths had diverged completely. Bertie had found, through Log and through Elizabeth, a way to survive what his childhood had done to him. But surviving and thriving were different things, and the throne was going to demand everything he had. David had not found survival. He had found Wallace, and Wallace was not survival, but surrender, the final, irrevocable choice of desire over duty. Mary had found silence, Henry had found obedience, George had found escape. And the old king, watching from the palace as his body failed him and his dynasty approached the precipice he had spent his life trying to prevent, understood one thing with terrible clarity. His eldest son was not going to be saved by the crown. The crown was going to need saving from him. George V died at Sandringham on the 20th of January 1936. He was 70 years old. His family was gathered. The nation knew he was gravely ill. The bulletins had been issued, the language of the court physicians carrying the careful, measured phrases that the British public had learned to decode as serious but not yet final. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close. That was the last bulletin, issued in the evening, and it became one of the most famous sentences in the history of royal communication. But the sentence was not entirely accurate. The king's life was not simply moving towards its close, it was being moved. 50 years later, in 1986, the diaries of Lord Dawson of Penn, George V's physician, were made public. What they revealed changed the story of the king's death permanently. Dawson had administered a lethal injection of cocaine and morphine to the dying king. The stated reasons were compassion and dignity. George was suffering, the end was inevitable, and Dawson wished to spare both the king and the family the indignity of a prolonged and public deterioration. But there was another reason, recorded in Dawson's own hand, that was less comfortable. He wished the death to be announced in the morning edition of the Times, rather than in the less appropriate evening papers. The timing of a king's death was, even in its final seconds, a matter of image management. There is something about that detail that belongs not in a footnote, but at the center of this story. George V had spent his life controlling appearances. He had renamed his dynasty to survive a war. He had pruned the royal family to make it leaner and more British. He had projected an image of sober, domestic, middle-class virtue that had saved the crown from the fate of every other great European monarchy. And now, at the very end, even his death was managed. The timing adjusted, the announcement calibrated, the public service maintained to the last breath and beyond it. The man who had taught his children that image mattered more than feeling had his own death shaped by the same principle. Whether George would have consented to Dawson's intervention is unknowable. What is certain is that the logic behind it, dignity over truth, appearance over reality, the controlled narrative over the messy, unpredictable facts of human suffering, was the logic George had applied to everything. It followed him out of the world the way it had governed everything within it. The funeral was conducted with the full ceremonial weight of the British state. George V was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on the 28th of January. The public mourning was genuine and immense. Here was a king who had been on the throne for 25 years, who had seen the country through a world war, who had become, almost despite himself, a beloved figure. The Jubilee crowds of the previous year had shown him how much the nation cared. Now the funeral crowds confirmed it. The streets of London were lined with mourners. The silence as the gun carriage passed was the silence of a country saying goodbye to a man who had represented something they valued: steadiness, reliability, the sense that somewhere at the top of the national life, there was a person who took his responsibilities seriously and who would not let them down. Inside the family, the grief was real, but complicated by what everyone knew was coming. George was dead. David was king. And the crisis that George had predicted, the ruin within 12 months, was no longer a prophecy. It was a clock that had started ticking. The family that gathered at Sandringham for the death was the family George had made. Queen Mary, composed, upright, devastated beneath a surface so controlled that her grief was visible only in the precision of her formality. David, the Prince of Wales, who was about to become king, who had spent decades resisting the throne and was now in a matter of hours going to occupy it. Bertie, the Duke of York, who understood with a clarity that must have been physically sickening what David's accession might mean for him if the crisis everyone feared actually materialized. Princess Mary, Henry, and George, the remaining children, each carrying their own version of a childhood, spent under the authority of the man who now lay dying in his bedroom at Sandringham. They had been frightened of him. They had been shaped by him. And now he was leaving them to manage the consequences of what he had built. A monarchy that was publicly invincible and privately fractured. A succession that the king himself had predicted would end in catastrophe. Edward VIII was proclaimed king on the 21st of January, 1936. The accession was automatic. The moment George died, David became sovereign. The formalities followed: the accession council, the proclamation, the public ceremonies that marked the transfer of the crown from father to son. The new king was 41 years old, unmarried, glamorous, modern in appearance, and popular with a public that did not yet know what the court, the cabinet, and the dominions already understood: that Edward VIII intended to marry Wallace Simpson, and that nothing, not the church, not the constitution, not the advice of his ministers, not the pleas of his family, was going to dissuade him. The first months of the new reign were an exercise in mounting institutional alarm disguised as the continuity. Edward performed the public functions of kingship, audiences, state papers, the ceremonial obligations that the calendar demanded, but those who worked with him noticed almost immediately that his attention was elsewhere. State documents were returned late or not returned at all. The red boxes, the daily dispatch of government papers, that every modern sovereign has treated as sacred duty, were handled with a carelessness that horrified the civil service. There were concerns, later substantiated, that confidential papers had been left in places where they might be seen by unauthorized eyes. Fort Belvedere, Edward's private residence in Windsor Great Park, had become the center of his life, not Buckingham Palace, not Windsor Castle, not the great state residences that embodied the continuity of the monarchy, but a private house where Wallace presided and where the atmosphere was that of a social gathering rather than a seat of government. The relationship between Edward and Wallace intensified through the spring and summer of 1936. In August, they cruised together in the eastern Mediterranean aboard the yacht Nalin, a voyage that was, by any reasonable assessment, an act of extraordinary recklessness for a reigning monarch whose relationship was already the subject of international attention. They were photographed together on deck, on shore, in the company of European dignitaries and socialites. Edward appeared relaxed, happy, sunburned, dressed in casual clothes that bore no resemblance to the formal attire his father would have demanded. Wallace was at his side. The American papers ran the pictures with headlines that left nothing to the imagination. The European papers ran the pictures. Newsreels showed the footage in cinemas across the continent. The British press, bound by the gentleman's agreement that had held since the early years of the relationship, published nothing. The gap between what the world knew and what the British public was told became farcical, then dangerous, then untenable. Members of Parliament received letters from constituents abroad, relatives in America, friends in France, asking what on earth was happening with the king. Foreign diplomats in London discussed the situation openly at dinner parties. The American ambassador reported to Washington. The court and the government lived in a state of anticipatory dread, watching the king conduct what amounted to a public romance with a married woman, while the country he ruled remained, by editorial agreement, officially ignorant of the whole affair. Wallace's divorce from Ernest Simpson was granted at Ipswich on the 27th of October, 1936. The decree Nisi would become absolute in 6 months. The last legal barrier between Edward's desire and the constitutional crisis that everyone had been trying to prevent had been removed. The timetable was now fixed. If Edward intended to marry Wallace, and he did with a certainty that nothing could shake, the crisis would arrive no later than the spring of 1937. Something would have to break before then. The autumn of 1936 was when the machinery of constitutional monarchy began to close around Edward VIII like a trap, though it would be more accurate to say that Edward walked into it voluntarily, with his eyes open and his mind made up. He told Stanley Baldwin, now Prime Minister for the third time, that he intended to marry Wallace. Baldwin told him, with the courteous firmness for which he was known, that the marriage was unacceptable to the government and to the dominions. The Church of England could not sanction the marriage of the Supreme Governor to a twice-divorced woman whose former husbands were both still living. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was implacably opposed. The Dominion government, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, were consulted and confirmed that they shared the British government's position. The options were narrowing with each passing week. Edward could give up Wallace, he could marry her morganatically, a compromise by which she would become his wife, but not queen, carrying a lesser title and with no claim to royal status for any children, or he could abdicate. The morganatic option was explored and rejected. The Dominions would not accept it. Baldwin would not support it. The legal mechanisms were uncertain, the constitutional precedents non-existent, and the political risk enormous. A morganatic marriage would require special legislation in every Dominion parliament, and the prospect of a parliamentary debate about the King's marriage in London, in Ottawa, in Canberra, in Wellington, in Pretoria was one that no government was willing to risk. The option died not because it was impossible in theory, but because it was unthinkable in practice. The men who ran the empire understood something that Edward did not. That the crown's authority rested on a consensus that could be broken by exactly this kind of public division, and that the cost of forcing the issue would be paid not by the king, but by the institution itself. The British public, when the press restraint finally broke in early December, learned for the first time what the rest of the world had known for months. And the reaction was not the wave of sympathy for the king that Edward had expected. The Bishop of Bradford, Alfred Blunt, made a public statement calling on the king to show greater awareness of his responsibilities. Whether Blunt intended the statement as a direct reference to the crisis or as a general call for piety remains debated, but Fleet Street treated it as the signal to break the story open. Within days, the newspapers were full of it. Photographs of Wallace appeared in every paper. The constitutional crisis that the establishment had been managing in private for months was now a national drama, played out in headlines, editorials, and the conversations of millions of people who had, until that week, no idea that their king was planning to marry a twice-divorced American and that the crown itself was at stake. Inside the family, the crisis produced responses that mapped precisely onto the childhood dynamics George V had created. Edward behaved as he had always behaved. He chose what he wanted and expected the world to accommodate him. He could not understand why the institution would not bend. He could not see that the crown was not his to negotiate with. He had spent his life resisting his father's authority, and now he was resisting the authority of the Constitution itself. Not out of principle, not out of political conviction, but out of the same emotional dependency that had driven every major decision of his adult life. He wanted Wallace. He could not live without her. Everything else, the crown, the empire, the family, the constitutional settlement of centuries, was secondary. Bertie watched the crisis unfold with a horror that those close to him described as almost physical. He did not want the throne. He had never wanted it. His life, Elizabeth, the girls, the quiet competence of the York household, the hard-won management of his stammer, the carefully constructed stability that Log and Elizabeth had helped him build, was about to be destroyed by his brother's choices. The prospect of kingship did not excite him. It terrified him. He knew what it would mean. The constant public speaking, the ceremonial obligations, the scrutiny, the relentless demand to be visible and fluent and composed in a way that his body and his temperament had never been designed to sustain. He knew that the stammer would be tested as it had never been tested before. He knew that the private world he had built, the world in which he was Bertie, not a king, would cease to exist the moment Edward signed the papers. Queen Mary's response was the response of a woman who had spent her entire life in service to the institution her son was about to abandon. She was devastated. She could not understand how a king could choose a woman over his duty. The code she had absorbed, the code George V had enforced, the code that had governed their marriage, their household, their treatment of their children, their handling of Johnny's illness, their management of every private crisis the family had faced, demanded that personal feeling yield to institutional obligation. Always, without exception, without negotiation. And here was her eldest son, the heir she had raised, the Prince of Wales who had charmed the empire, telling her that he would rather give up the throne than live without a twice-divorced American woman. To Mary, this was not romance. It was betrayal. It was the repudiation of everything the family stood for. She told him so. It made no difference. Princess Mary, Henry, and George occupied the positions they had always occupied, loyal, present, unable to alter the outcome. The younger siblings could not overrule the heir. They could not force him to stay. They could not protect Bertie from what was coming. They could only watch as the family's internal fracture, the fracture that had been forming since the nursery at York Cottage, since the first time George V shouted at a son who could not meet his standards, became a constitutional event that the entire world was watching. The final days of the crisis moved with a speed that left little room for reflection. Edward had made his decision. The government had made its position clear. The dominions had confirmed their opposition. The church was immovable. The public was divided, but the establishment was united. There was nothing left to negotiate. On the 10th of December, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. The document declared his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for himself and for his descendants. It was witnessed by three men, his brothers Albert, Duke of York, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. The National Archives preserves the record. The legislation confirms the details, but the documents cannot convey what the room contained. The scene must be rendered not as the Hook rendered it, with the shock of arrival, the disorientation of beginning in the middle of a catastrophe, but with the full weight of everything that has been built across the preceding hours of this documentary. The audience knows now what each man in that room was carrying. They know about York Cottage and the father who shouted. They know about Johnny at Wood Farm and the Christmas night car right back to the edge of the estate. They know about the stammer and the splints and the forced right-handedness. They know about Log and the breathing exercises and the Canberra speech. They know about Freda and Thelma and the pattern of dependency that led to Wallace. They know about the 1917 proclamation and the letters patent and the manufactured name. They know what Windsor cost, the room at Fort Belvedere, the desk, the papers laid out with the formality that accompanies even the destruction of a succession. Edward, composed, almost eerily calm in the accounts of those who were present, the calm of a man who has finally stopped fighting a decision he made long ago, the pen in his hand, the act of signing, the physical gesture, the movement of hand across paper, the scratching of ink that transforms an intention into a constitutional fact. Edward signs 7 copies, one for each Dominion Parliament. The signatures accumulate. Each one is another door closing. Albert watches. He is 41 years old. He has a wife and 2 daughters. He has a stammer that he has spent a decade learning to manage. He has a private life that he loves and a public role that he has learned to endure. And in the time it takes his brother to write his name, all of it changes. The crown is moving towards him, not because he sought it, not because he earned it, not because anyone in the room believes this is the best outcome, but because his elder brother cannot bear the weight of duty, and the line of succession does not stop for personal preference. Henry watches. He is 36. He has been the obedient son his entire life, the military man, the dutiful brother, the Windsor child who survived by causing no trouble. He is watching his eldest brother abandon the institution their father built, and he is watching his second brother receive the burden their father always feared would come to him. Henry cannot intervene. He can only witness. His signature on the document is the signature of a man who has been trained since childhood to stand where he is told and do what is required. George watches. He is 33. He is the glamorous brother, the one whose private life has already caused the family anxiety, the one whose own struggles with substances and relationships have been managed through the same method of surface control that the family applies to everything. He is watching the consequences of a household that taught its children to fear rather than to feel. And he is watching those consequences play out not in a private room, but on the stage of constitutional history. His own death in an RAF crash on a Scottish hillside 6 years from now, as invisible to everyone in the room. He signs as witness. He stands where the family needs him. He does not speak. The instrument is signed. The witnesses have added their names. The document will go to Parliament. His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act will receive royal assent the following day, the 11th of December, and Edward's reign will end. 325 days on the throne. The shortest reign of any English or British monarch since the Lady Jane Grey, and the only voluntary abdication in the history of the crown. Edward broadcast to the nation that evening from Windsor Castle. He was no longer king. He had been introduced by Sir John Reith, the Director General of the BBC, as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. The BBC carried his voice into millions of homes. He spoke of the woman he loved, of the burden of the crown, of his brother who would succeed him. He described the new king, Bertie, as a man who possessed one matchless blessing not bestowed on him, a happy home with his wife and children. The broadcast was dignified, emotional, and carefully written, partly by Edward himself, partly by Winston Churchill, who had supported the king's cause throughout the crisis and now helped him craft his farewell. The public heard a love story, a man giving up a throne for a woman. It was romantic, it was sad. It was, in the vocabulary of the 1930s, almost unbearably dramatic. Across the country, people gathered around their wireless sets and listened to a prince explain that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. What the broadcast did not say, what it could not say, because the man speaking had never understood it, was that the matchless blessing he attributed to his brother had been won through years of pain, therapy, perseverance, and the support of a wife who had married a damaged second son, expecting a quiet life, and was about to be given the opposite. Edward's broadcast was generous towards Bertie. It was also, in its way, the final expression of his lifelong inability to see beyond his own experience. He had always believed that the difference between himself and his brother was simply that Bertie was better suited to domestic happiness. He could not see that the real difference was that Bertie had learned, through suffering, how to carry something he did not want, and that Edward had never learned to carry anything at all. But the broadcast was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. The man who mattered now was not the man who had spoken to the nation. It was the man who had stood in the room at Fort Belvedere and watched his brothers sign away the crown. Bertie, Albert, George VI, as he would now be styled. He had not chosen this. He had not prepared for it. He had spent his life as the second son, the spare, the brother whose stammer and whose temperament marked him as the one who would support the throne, not occupy it. And now the throne was his, not because he had earned it or sought it, but because his father had raised two sons, one who could not carry duty and one who could not escape it. And the one who could not carry it had finally put it down. The abdication shattered Bertie's life. Those close to him reported that in the days and weeks following the signing at Fort Belvedere, he was overwhelmed. Not by ambition, not by excitement, but by a grief and anxiety so profound that some members of the establishment privately questioned whether he was capable of the role. He wept. He told his cousin, Lord Mountbatten, that he had never wanted this, that he was not equipped for it, that the prospect filled him with dread. He faced the prospect of a coronation, a ceremony that would require him to speak publicly at length in the most significant religious and constitutional ritual the monarchy possessed, with a fear that connected directly to every childhood humiliation his father had inflicted. The boy who had been shouted at for stammering was about to stand in Westminster Abbey and swear an oath before God, the archbishop, the peers of the realm, the representatives of the dominions, and the nation listening on the wireless, and the words would have to come. Every single one of them, without hesitation, without the pauses that had defined his public life, without the visible struggle, that had made Wembley a catastrophe. He chose to reign as George VI, not as Albert, which would have been the more obvious choice, but as George in tribute to his father. That decision carries its own weight. The man whose childhood had been defined by his father's severity chose, in the moment of his accession, to honor his father's name. Whether this was an act of genuine reverence or an attempt to claim the authority of a man whose approval he had spent his life trying to earn, or simply a pragmatic decision to signal the continuity in a moment of crisis, is a question that admits no simple answer. Perhaps it was all three. George VI. The name itself was a statement. It said, "The line holds. The House of Windsor continues. The father's work survives, even though the son, who was supposed to carry it forward, has abandoned it." Elizabeth steadied him. She had always steadied him. But the weight was different now. This was not a charity dinner or a hospital opening or a speech at an exhibition. This was the crown of the United Kingdom and the dominions, the headship of the Commonwealth, the supreme governorship of the Church of England, and the role that his father had spent a lifetime convincing everyone, including fatally his eldest son, could only be carried through fear and discipline. Bertie would have to carry it differently. He would have to carry it through pain. Log was there. He would be there for the coronation on the 12th of May in 1937, positioned in the abbey where the new king could see him. A familiar face in a sea of ermine, gold, and ceremony. The man from Adelaide who had taught a prince to breathe. The coronation itself was a test of everything Log and Bertie had built together over the preceding decade. The oaths, the responses, the long sequences of ritual speech that the ceremony demanded. All of it required the king to speak clearly, fluently, and with the authority that the occasion demanded. Bertie prepared with the same meticulous discipline he applied to everything, rehearsing with Log, practicing the breathing techniques, marking the difficult passages in the text, building the muscle memory that would carry him through the moments when his body tried to betray him. On the day, he managed it, not perfectly. There were hesitations that those who knew him well could detect, but functionally, convincingly, with a dignity that silenced the skeptics who had questioned whether the stammering Duke of York could carry the weight of a crown. The Archbishop placed the crown on his head. The peers shouted their acclamation. The guns fired, and Bertie, George VI, was king. Log would remain at his side through everything that followed, the broadcasts, the public appearances, the slow accumulation of duties that would transform a reluctant heir into a functioning constitutional monarch. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records that Log coached the king for the coronation, was present for the VE Day broadcast in 1945, and regarded the friendship between them as the greatest pleasure of his life. That detail, the greatest pleasure of his life, carries a warmth that the Windsor household had rarely produced. Log loved Bertie, not as a subject loves a king, not as a therapist loves a successful case, but as a man loves a friend. He has helped to survive something that might have destroyed him. Their relationship was the counterpoint to everything George V's nursery had produced. It was built on trust rather than fear, on patience rather than punishment, on the radical idea that a man's weakness was not a moral failing, but a condition that could be addressed with skill and kindness. The throne had passed, but the damage had not. George V's eldest son had escaped the crown, had slipped out of the prison of duty as he had always slipped out of every constraint his father tried to impose, seeking freedom and finding, as he always did, only a different form of dependence. His second son had been trapped inside it, had received, without asking and without preparation, the burden that his father had always feared would come to him. The younger brothers had witnessed the collapse without the power to prevent it. Queen Mary had watched the code of duty fail in the son who was born to represent it, had seen the principle she had devoted her life to maintaining repudiated by her own child in front of the entire world, and the daughter who had learned silence, and the son who had learned obedience, and the son whose private rebellions took quieter but no less destructive forms. All of them were left to carry the family forward under a new king who had never wanted the name. And now the country was about to discover whether a frightened child could become a king, whether the boy who had stammered under his father's contempt could find, somewhere inside himself, a voice steady enough to hold a nation together. Because what was coming, what none of them could yet see clearly, though the shadows were already gathering across Europe, would require exactly that, a voice, a steady voice, and the man who would have to provide it was a man whose entire life had been a lesson in what it meant to be told that his voice was not enough. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The country had known it was coming. The Munich Agreement of the previous year had bought time, not peace. And the invasion of Poland 2 days earlier had left no room for further negotiation. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, announced the declaration of war in a radio broadcast that morning. And that evening, King George VI addressed the nation. The broadcast was everything. Not because the words were extraordinary. They were measured, sober, appropriate, the language of constitutional duty rather than rhetorical brilliance. They had been drafted and redrafted, worked over by officials and by Log, shaped to avoid the consonant clusters and plosive sounds that caused the king the most difficulty. But because the man speaking them was a man the country now knew, they knew about the stammer. They knew about the abdication, that the king had not wanted the throne and had received it only because his brother had abandoned it. They knew, even if they did not possess the private details, that this was a man for whom the act of speaking was not natural but effortful, not easy but brave. And here he was, speaking to them on the most frightening evening the country had faced since the summer of 1914, and the voice was steady, not perfect. Not the smooth, confident voice of a man who had been born to public speech. There were hesitations, moments where those who understood the condition could hear the effort behind the fluency, the discipline required to push through the places where the words wanted to lock, the tiny recalibrations of breathing that kept the sentences flowing. But the voice held. The sentences completed themselves. The king told his people that they were called to meet the challenge of a principle that, if it were to prevail, would be fatal to any civilized order in the world. He asked them to stand calm, firm, and united. He asked for God's help. And for the first time, many of them understood, not intellectually, but in the chest, in the stomach, in the place where courage and fear coexist. What it had cost this particular man to say those particular words. The stammer had not been cured, it had been overcome. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a man who has never known fear and a man who has known it every day of his life and refuses to let it win. Lionel Log was present for the broadcast. He had been with Bertie in the room, coaching him through the text, marking the difficult passages, reminding him of the breathing techniques they had practiced for over a decade. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records that Log was present for the wartime broadcast and that he regarded his friendship with the king as the greatest achievement of his professional life. The image is worth holding. A king and his speech therapist alone in a room at Buckingham Palace about to address a nation going to war. The king is the son of George V, the son who stammered, the son who was shouted at, the son whose body betrayed the family's code of perfection. The therapist is a man from Adelaide who has no title, no social position, no connection to the British establishment, and who has done something that the entire apparatus of the royal household, with all its discipline and authority and tradition, could not do. He has taught the king to speak. The private wound has become, through pain and persistence, a public instrument. The boy whose father treated his stammer as a moral failing is using his voice to steady a nation. George VI's wartime reign became the emotional reversal of everything George V's household had produced. Not because George VI abandoned his father's values, he did not. Duty, discipline, service, the suppression of personal preference in favor of institutional obligation, all of these remained. The Windsor Code survived. What changed was the quality of the presence behind it. George V had projected authority through fear. The fear of his household, the fear of his children, the fear of anyone who served him and understood that his temper could detonate without warning. George VI projected authority through endurance. He stayed in London during the Blitz, night after night, as the Luftwaffe dropped incendiary and high-explosive bombs on the capital. The king and queen remained at Buckingham Palace, sleeping there, working there, visible to the civil defense workers and the fire crews and the people of London who were enduring the same bombardment without the option of retreating to a country estate. They chose not to send the Princess Elizabeth and Margaret, 13 and 10 when the war began, drawn to Canada, as some members of the government had urged. Elizabeth the Queen said that the children would not leave without her, that she would not leave without the king, and that the king would not leave at all. The logic was circular, and the point was absolute. This family was staying. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times during the war. The chapel was destroyed. Windows were blown out. On one occasion, bombs fell in the quadrangle while the king and queen were in residence. Elizabeth reportedly said, after that attack, that she was glad the palace had been hit because it meant she could look the East End in the face, the East End being the part of London that had suffered the heaviest and most sustained bombing, the part of the city where working-class families had lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their lives. Whether those were her exact words or a polished version of the sentiment, the emotional logic was sound. The royal family could not ask the country to endure what they were not willing to endure themselves, and they endured it. George visited the troops. He toured bombed cities, walking through the rubble of Coventry, of Plymouth, of the East End, meeting people who had lost everything and offering them the only thing a constitutional monarch can offer, the knowledge that someone at the top of the national life cared enough to come and see. He awarded medals, inspected factories, met with Churchill, who had initially supported Edward during the abdication crisis, but who now found in George VI a partner whose quiet determination matched his own rhetorical fire. He did everything his father had done during the First World War, but with a crucial difference. The country could see that it cost him something. His courage was not the effortless confidence of a man born to command. It was the willed, deliberate, hard-won courage of a man who had spent his life being told he was not adequate and who was proving day after day, broadcast after broadcast, visit after bombed city after hospital ward, that adequacy was not about the absence of fear, but about the refusal to be governed by it. The public saw a king who stammered and who carried on anyway. They saw a queen who smiled through the rubble and made tea for the rescue workers. They saw a family that stayed. And the image worked, not as propaganda, not as the manufactured performance that George V would have engineered, but as something closer to truth. George VI was genuinely brave. His bravery was simply a different kind from the one his father would have recognized. Not the bravery of a man who does not feel fear, but the bravery of a man who feels it constantly and carries on regardless. The war years also brought the family its next casualty. On the 25th of August, 1942, Prince George, Duke of Kent, was killed when his RAF Sunderland flying boat crashed into a hillside called Eagle's Rock, near Dunbeath in the Scottish Highlands. He was 39 years old. He was flying to Iceland on official duties. The aircraft hit the hillside in poor visibility. All aboard were killed except the rear gunner, who survived the crash and was found by a local shepherd. George was the first member of the royal family to die on active service in more than 500 years. The death was devastating, and it carried a particular resonance within the family story this documentary has been telling. George, Duke of Kent, had been the glamorous brother, the one whose social life and private difficulties had caused the family anxiety throughout the 1920s and 30s, the brother whose struggles with drugs and with relationships that the household could not acknowledge had been managed through the same method of surface control that the Windsors applied to every crisis. But he had also been, by many accounts, the most naturally gifted of the brothers, the one with the keenest aesthetic sense, the most fluid social intelligence, the most genuine curiosity about the world beyond the court. His marriage to Marina had stabilized him, or appeared to. His children had given him purpose. His wartime service had given him a role that suited his energy and his need to be useful. And now he was gone, killed not by the enemy, but by weather and terrain and the ordinary terrible hazards of wartime aviation. His wife, Princess Marina, was left with 3 children, Edward, Alexandra, and Michael, the youngest, born only 7 weeks before his father's death. Marina would never remarry. She would spend the rest of her life as a royal widow, dignified, beautiful, increasingly private, raising her children in the shadow of a loss that the family absorbed the way it absorbed every loss, with composure, with duty, and with the understanding that private grief must not be allowed to overwhelm the public surface. For George VI, the loss of his brother was personal in a way that went beyond the general sorrow of wartime bereavement. George, Duke of Kent, had been the brother closest to him in certain ways, not the rebel David, not the invisible Henry, but the brother who had shared something of Bertie's sensitivity, even if he had expressed it through escape rather than endurance. They had been close in a family where closeness was difficult, and where the siblings had each found their own strategies for surviving their father's household. The death at Eagle's Rock was another fracture in a family that had already been fractured beyond repair by the abdication, and it came during the darkest period of the war, 1942, the year of Stalingrad and El Alamein, the year when the outcome was still uncertain and the demands on the king were relentless. George VI bore it, he continued. He made the broadcast look, helped him prepare. He visited the troops. He met with Churchill. The king's stammer did not return in full force. The voice held, but the cost was written in his body, in the deepening lines on his face, in the fatigue that those close to him could not fail to notice, in the chain smoking that had become his most visible private habit and that would, within a decade, kill him. While George VI carried the crown through wartime, Edward carried his exile. He and Wallace married on the 3rd of June, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. No member of the royal family attended. The title Duchess of Windsor was granted to Wallace, but the style of Her Royal Highness was withheld. A decision that caused Edward lasting bitterness and that he attributed to the influence of Elizabeth, the new queen, whom he never forgave. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor would spend the rest of their lives in a kind of gilded displacement. Wealthy, socially active, internationally mobile, but permanently exiled from the institution that had defined both their lives. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, a posting that removed him from Europe during the war and that was widely understood as a way of keeping him out of trouble. There had been concerns, serious ones documented in government files, but about his political sympathies and his contacts with figures in Nazi Germany. Whether those concerns were justified or exaggerated, it remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is that the British government did not trust the former king, and that his wartime role was designed to be as far from the centers of power as geography permitted. The Windsors' post-war life settled into a pattern of luxurious irrelevance. They lived in Paris, in a house in the Bois de Boulogne that the French government made available to them. They entertained, they attended parties. They were photographed at galas, at restaurants, at the homes of the international rich. They were, in the vocabulary of the mid-20th century café society, glamorous, rootless, and increasingly marginal. Edward never returned to a public role in Britain. He visited occasionally, attended family funerals, maintained a correspondence with his mother that was more dutiful than warm. The relationship between Edward and the family that remained in Britain was governed by a coldness that never fully thawed. The withholding of HRH from Wallace was a wound that Edward picked at for the rest of his life. He blamed Elizabeth. He blamed the establishment. He blamed everyone except himself. Wallace managed him as she had always managed him, with the combination of authority and attentiveness that he required, and that he had sought from women since the first years of his adult life. Whether their marriage was happy is a question that depends on what happiness meant to Edward, and what it meant to Wallace. He had what he had wanted, the woman, the freedom from the crown, a life organized around his own preferences rather than the institution's demands. What he did not have was purpose. The man who had given up the throne for love had found love and lost everything else. The role, the respect, the sense of mattering that the crown, for all its burdens, had provided. The parties continued. The photographs continued. The sense that something essential was missing, in some weight, some substance, some reason to be, pervaded the accounts of those who knew them in their later years. Edward died on the 28th of May, 1972 in Paris of throat cancer. He was 77. Wallace survived him by 14 years. Increasingly frail, increasingly isolated, cared for by staff in the Paris house as her health and her mind deteriorated. She died on the 24th of April, 1986, at the age of 89. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, the castle that had given the family its manufactured name, the castle that Edward had left behind when he chose Wallace over the crown. In death, they returned to the estate they had been exiled from in life. The symmetry was the kind the Windsors specialized in, elegant, painful, and slightly hollow. Queen Mary lived long enough to see all of it: the abdication, the war, the Reconstruction, the austerity years, the Festival of Britain, the beginning of her granddaughter's reign. She died on the 24th of March, 1953, at Marlborough House in London, at the age of 85, 10 weeks before the coronation of Elizabeth II, an event she had expressly asked not to be postponed on account of her death. Even in dying, she served the institution. Even in her final request, the code held the crown comes first, always, without exception. Elizabeth II had acceded to the throne on the 6th of February 1952, following George VI's death at Sandringham from coronary thrombosis. He was 56 years old. His health had been declining for years, visibly, unmistakably in a way that the public could see even through the careful management of royal communications. The lung cancer diagnosed in 1951 had led to the removal of his left lung. He appeared at public events looking gaunt, diminished, a man whose body was failing him with the same cruelty it had shown when it locked his speech in childhood. He had reigned for 15 years. He had carried the crown through a world war, through the partition of India, through the beginning of the Cold War, through the creation of the National Health Service, through the transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth. He had done everything that was asked of him. He had spoken when speaking terrified him. He had endured what endurance cost. And on the morning of the 6th of February, 1952, a valet brought his tea to his bedroom at Sandringham and found him dead. He had died in his sleep, at the house where he had been born, in the room where his father had died 16 years before. The symmetry was almost unbearable. Two kings of the House of Windsor, father and son, dying at Sandringham, the first after a reign of discipline, and the managed death that followed it, the second after a reign of pain and the quiet death that ended it. Mary outlived her husband by 17 years and two of her sons. She had watched Edward abandon the throne and George, Duke of Kent, die on a Scottish hillside. She had watched Bertie receive the crown he never wanted and carry it through a war that might have broken a stronger man. She had watched her granddaughter become queen at the age of 25, a young woman inheriting the throne not because the succession had followed its natural course, but because the abdication had redirected it, pushing the crown sideways from one line to another, from David to Bertie to Elizabeth. Everything about Queen Mary's later life was the consequence of what had happened in the nursery at York Cottage and in the household at Sandringham, and she bore those consequences with the same discipline she had applied to everything, silently, completely, without public complaint. Princess Mary, the only daughter, the quiet thread that has run through this story without ever demanding the center of attention, outlived both her parents and three of her brothers. She continued her charitable work, her duties as Princess Royal, her life at Harewood House in Yorkshire. She died on the 28th of March, 1965, at the age of 67, while walking the grounds of the estate that had been her home for more than 4 decades. Her death was sudden, a heart attack during an afternoon walk. And it carried, like so much in this family, a quality of understatement that matched the way she had lived. She had been the daughter who learned silence. She had learned it so well that the historical record barely contains her voice. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, the obedient son, lived until 1974. He had served as Governor-General of Australia during the war, had carried out decades of royal duties without controversy or complaint, and had suffered a series of strokes in his later years that left him increasingly incapacitated. His wife, Princess Alice, cared for him through his decline with a devotion that echoed, in its own way, Lullabill's care for Johnny. The family's pattern of private devotion existing alongside its public composure. Henry died at the age of 74, the last of George V's sons, the one who had survived by never giving anyone a reason to notice him. When Mary died, when Henry died, when the last direct witnesses to the household at York Cottage and the nursery at Sandringham passed from living memory into history, the direct experience of what George V's fatherhood had felt like disappeared with them. What remained was the record, the biographies, the diaries, the letters, the memoirs of courtiers and friends, and the institutional legacy that outlasted every individual who had helped to build it. The cultural afterlife of this story belongs more than anything to a single film. The King's Speech, released in 2010, starred Colin Firth as George VI, Geoffrey Rush as Lionel Log, and Helena Bonham Carter as Queen Elizabeth. The film focused on the relationship between Bertie and Log, the sessions in Harley Street, the breathing exercises, the growing trust between a king and a commoner, the terror of the microphone, and the triumph of the 1939 wartime broadcast. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It made the story of George VI stammer the most widely known fact about the mid-20th century British monarchy. And it did something that very few historical films achieve. It made an audience feel, viscerally and personally, what it meant to be unable to speak, to stand before a microphone and feel the words lock in your throat while the nation waited. What the film captured was real. The intimacy between Log and Bertie, the terror of public speech for a man whose body had been trained by anxiety to resist it, the emotional stakes of the microphone age, the way that radio transformed monarchy from a visual institution into an auditory one, demanding not just presence but voice, the way a private wound could become, through the peculiar alchemy of duty and courage, a public strength. All of this was true, and the film conveyed it with a craft and a sensitivity that made millions of people care about a king who had been dead for nearly 60 years. What the film necessarily simplified was the larger family system. The King's Speech is a story about two men in a room. It is not a story about six children in a nursery. The film touches on George V's severity, but it cannot render the full architecture of the household, the removal of Johnny to Wood Farm, the pattern of David's emotional dependency, the quiet containment of Princess Mary, the obedience of Henry, the glamorous self-destruction of George, Duke of Kent. It cannot show the decades of accumulated damage that preceded the abdication, or the way that each child's response to the father's tyranny was a variation on a single theme. How do you survive a household where fear is the dominant emotion and love is indistinguishable from control? The film tells one strand of the story brilliantly. The documentary you have been watching attempts to tell the whole web. Jane Ridley's biography, George V, Never a Dull Moment, published in 2021, provides the most recent major reassessment of the man at the center of this story. The book's public summary frames George V as the founder of the modern monarchy, whose family quarrel with his eldest son culminated in the existential crisis of abdication. Ridley does not reduce George to a villain. She presents him as a man who achieved something extraordinary, the reinvention of a monarchy that might otherwise have perished, while also acknowledging that the same qualities that saved the crown damaged the family. The tension between those two truths is the tension at the heart of this entire narrative. George V was not simply a bad father. He was a father whose virtues, when applied to children rather than to institutions, became indistinguishable from cruelty. What remains is the House of Windsor itself, the name George V created on the 17th of July, 1917, in a proclamation designed to save the monarchy from the consequences of its own German ancestry. The name survived, the institution survived. The public image of a sober, dutiful, domestically reassuring monarchy, the image George constructed and maintained through World War, constitutional crisis, Irish upheaval, the transformation of empire, and the rise of mass democracy, became the template that every subsequent monarch has followed. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years inside the frame her grandfather built. Windsor as surname, duty as identity, domesticity as public reassurance, crisis managed through composure, and the private cost of the arrangement borne silently by the people inside it. The direct consequences of the abdication ran through Elizabeth II's entire life. She became heir because her uncle abdicated and her father became king. She grew up not in the quiet, private world of a second son's household, but in the glare of a monarchy that was still recovering from its worst self-inflicted wound. She learned from her father's example that the crown could be carried with grace even by someone who had not been born to expect it. And she learned from her uncle's example that personal desire, when placed above institutional duty, could bring the whole edifice to the point of collapse. Whether consciously or not, Elizabeth II's entire reign was a response to what had happened in her father's generation. The fear that if the crown was not carried with absolute discipline, absolute commitment, and absolute suppression of private feeling, it might be dropped again. The lesson of the abdication was the lesson of George V's nursery, transmitted through one more generation. Duty first, always, without exception, without negotiation. The story is therefore not a sealed family tragedy from the 1930s. It is the emotional prehistory of the modern monarchy. Every time a Windsor struggles with the tension between private life and public duty, every time the institution closes ranks around a crisis, every time personal feeling is subordinated to the needs of the crown, every time a member of the family discovers that the price of the name is the suppression of whatever does not fit the image, the echo of George V's household can be heard. The code survives, the name survives, the cost survives. There is no neat moral to this story. George V gave Britain the modern monarchy, disciplined, visibly dutiful, British in name, careful in image, and capable of surviving a century that destroyed many royal houses. He navigated crises that would have overwhelmed a less determined man. He built something that lasted, but inside his own family, the same virtues hardened into fear. The discipline that saved the crown became the tyranny that broke his children. His sons inherited not only titles, houses, and duties, but a private language of reprimand, silence, and shame that shaped their lives as profoundly as any act of parliament. One son escaped into abdication and spent the rest of his life in luxurious exile, seeking in Wallace Simpson the authority and tenderness that his father's household had never provided. One son endured the throne through pain and carried it with a courage that his father would have recognized as a duty, but that was, in truth, something more generous and more human than duty alone. One son disappeared into illness, removed from the family portrait because his body could not perform what the image required, and died at 13 in a farmhouse at the edge of the estate where he was born. One daughter learned silence so thoroughly that the historical record barely contains her voice. One son learned obedience so completely that his life left almost no trace beyond the fact of his loyalty. And one son learned escape, sought sensation and pleasure and danger as antidotes to a childhood built on control, and died at 39 on a Scottish hillside, the first royal to fall in active service in half a millennium. The public saw Windsor. The children knew what it cost. And if there is a single image that holds the whole of this story, not the abdication, not the coronation, not the wartime broadcast, but something quieter and more devastating, it is this. Christmas night, 1918. Sandringham. A car driving through the Norfolk darkness, carrying a 13-year-old boy with epilepsy back to Wood Farm after the family dinner. The main house is lit behind him. His brothers and sister are inside. His parents are inside. The family is together, and he is being taken to the edge of the estate because his suffering does not fit the picture. Lalla Bill is waiting for him at the farmhouse. In 3 weeks, he will be dead. No one in the car and no one in the house knows that this is the last Christmas. The family will go on. The monarchy will go on. The name George V invented will outlast them all. But the boy in the car is the truth the name was built to hide. That the House of Windsor was a masterpiece of public image and a catastrophe of private love. And the people who paid the price were the ones who could not leave.